am incredibly pleased to announce a conversation with Senior Fellow Thomas Kent, who has written 2 books for us at Jamestown. The first is Striking Back, and the second, which is the subject today, How Russia Loses, Hubris and Miscalculation of Putin's Kremlin. And I think they are, together, perhaps the best antidote to strategic passivity that afflicts a lot of us in dealing with Russia and describing the schemes of President Putin to 4-dimensional chess or some other form of strategy that we don't understand. I think Tom does a very nice job of explaining this and showing that yes, we too can have an impact, and we have our own tools and means against a very fallible form of statecraft coming from Moscow. Tom Kent has been a senior fellow with the Jamestown Foundation. Unfortunately, he is leaving us to be a senior fellow at the American Foreign Policy Council, but he's among good friends and good company, so I hope this won't be the last. He teaches and he consults on Russian affairs, journalism, and the problems of propaganda and disinformation. He was the president of Radio Free Europe and Radio Liberty until 2018, and he now teaches at Columbia University and consults in the world. He is also an associate fellow with Slovakia's GOBSEC, and previously he was the Moscow bureau chief for the Associated Press, the head of AP's international news coverage, and editor for Standards and Ethics. Talking with him today is Margarita Assenova, who is one of the senior fellows with the Jamestown Foundation. She's a regular contributor to our Eurasia Daily Monitor, covering politics and energy security developments in the Balkans and Central Asia. She was a recipient of the John Knight Professional Journalism Fellowship at Stanford University for her reporting on nationalism in the Balkans. And she has authored numerous book chapters, reports, and journal articles on security, energy, and democracy published by CSIS, Brassey's Freedom House, Bertelsmann Foundation, University of New Haven, and of course, the Jamestown Foundation. And with that, I'll turn it over to Margarita and Tom.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Peter, for this introduction. I'm really pleased today to introduce Dr. Thomas Kent's new book, the latest excellent book, How Russia Loses. At the time when a lot is seen, a lot is being written about the dangers of Kremlin subversion in many parts of the world, he has focused on an interesting pattern of Moscow miscalculation and eventually losing when it often as a result of counteractions by the West, by local civil society, by smart government tactics, and people's pure desire, pure aspirations to live better, to become part of more prosperous unions such as the European Union, and seek security through more reliable partners such as NATO. Dr. Kent focuses on 6 case studies ranging from Russian attempts to build influence in Ukraine, Ecuador, South Africa, and North Macedonia, to its efforts to promote Nord Stream 2 pipeline and its Russia's Sputnik COVID-19 vaccine. In each of them, Russian policy has failed to achieve its goals, often because Moscow chooses authoritarian allies who quickly lose power, or because of its own miscalculation. And since the Russian full-scale invasion of Ukraine began, we can see this pattern is developing further. We can see that the list of Russian failures has only grown. Instead of curtailing NATO enlargement, Putin's war has only resulted in new countries joining the alliance, Finland and Sweden. Plans for Ukraine to join NATO are on the table, and together with Moldova, they became candidates for EU membership. Europe's energy dependence on Russia collapsed completely, as Russian oil is now down by 90%. The supplies are down by 90% in Europe, and Russian gas by 75%. The most dramatic change took place in Germany, the one country that most supported Nord Stream 1 and Nord Stream 2, and Germany has gotten rid of not only Russian gas deliveries, but also taken control of all Russian energy assets in the country. Furthermore, Russia has lost its credibility in the world, on the world stage, and its international reputation has suffered an enormous blow. This is particularly palpable in neighboring states such as the Caucasus and Central Asia. Russia's propaganda has also become hollow unimaginative, and in my opinion, outright sloppy in recent days. But it is still expanding, especially in the South. And in the South, we see attempts to influence Latin America and now Africa, as the State Department statement yesterday pointed out, to new attempts to influence African societies. So the list of failures will become longer as Russia continues to conduct a really brutal war full of war crimes and stealing children and all these atrocities committed in Ukraine. The list will be longer, and we can discuss Russia's failures in more detail now with Tom. And let's start with the first question. The Kremlin has launched a long-term subversion campaign in many corners of the world. In the book, you provide extensive background on Russia's relations with the 4 countries and regions that you studied. What policies led to Russia's failures and will likely lead to future failures as well?
Well, thanks very much, Margarita, and let me say first to thank Peter Madison, the Jamestown Foundation, for the very substantial support they've provided over 2 books, wonderful colleagues to work with, and I look forward to remaining a good colleague in the future. I should also say, by means of full disclosure, that I'm actually not a doctor. But thank you. It's always very nice to be called one. I came up as a journalist, and we're not big on education, but I do my best. This is echoing a little bit. I don't know if it's causing a problem for you, but maybe we just move up or back. Can you hear me okay from here? All right, fine, very good. Yes, this book is a little counterintuitive in some ways, because Margarita is quite right in terms of probably the long-term damage that Russia has done to itself through the Ukraine invasion and other adventures. But to many people, particularly those who don't follow Russia very closely, it looks like Putin is this great master of influence, and the whole world is putty in his hands. But in my investigation, I did find that there are a number of things that Russia tends to do wrong and continues to do wrong that, properly exploited, could be actually very useful to the West and to Western interests, and more important, to the cause of democracy and human rights generally. So I did delve into that. And to start with the countries that Margarita referred to, that I looked at, Ukraine, Ecuador, Macedonia, South Africa, what were sort of patterns of Russian behavior that I identified that I thought would be of interest. And let me just be specific about what I mean about these countries, what I was looking at. In Ukraine, I was looking at the period from Putin's rise to power to the point where somehow he figured he had to invade. The Russians essentially, under his leadership, ran a reverse influence operation in Ukraine for 20 years, bringing about a deterioration of Russian relations in Ukraine instead of building up relations. In Ecuador, I looked at the reign of President Rafael Correa from about 2007 to 2017, a very pro-Russia, pro-China, pro-Iran, anti-American leader who famously gave refuge in the Ecuadorian embassy in London to Assange, Julian Assange. And yet, in the course of that administration of Correa, he took a rather transactional attitude. He was interested in what Russia could do for him. And one really wonders at the end who played whom. The Russian influence in Ecuador was not enough to get Correa to do everything that Moscow would have liked. Then in Macedonia, I looked at the period particularly of 2018 to 2019, when there was a need to have Macedonia essentially change its constitution and rename itself to North Macedonia. in order to move aside Greek objections and allow Macedonia to join NATO and the EU. And then in South Africa, what I looked at was the reign of Jacob Zuma as South African president. Again, a very pro-Russian president. Made countless trips to Moscow on the phone, we understand, with Putin very, very frequently. Great ally. Where Russia massively overplayed its hand. And Putin managed to concoct with Zuma a very, very extensive and expensive deal for nuclear power plants that would have pretty much broken the bank, involved as much money as South Africa's entire government budget. And it collapsed under the pressure of civil society groups, including some Russian environmentalists who provided important information, led to the resignation of Zuma and a decline in Russian influence in South Africa. Now, you will note that Russian influence seems ascendant there, although not quite to the level one might expect. You'll recall that that there was a BRICS summit in South Africa last year, and there was talk about Putin coming. In fact, he was invited, and then the International Criminal Court did the war crimes indictment against him. And South Africa could have said, well, who cares? He can come and we won't arrest him. They've done that before in South Africa when people have come through under indictment. But this was too much even for the present Russia-friendly South African government to stomach. And so Putin appeared there by video. So to Margarita's question about what kind of weaknesses we see if we put these kinds of operations together, I'll just mention a few of them briefly, and then we can come back to them in more detail as Margarita desires. One of them is the Russian tendency to make alliances with leaders who may be a rather thin layer of elites without putting roots down into the population and trying to really get people on side. This is very efficient because you can make a lot of progress very quickly with an elite that wants support. But if that elite disappears, as it did in all of these cases sooner or later, you're left with very little if you haven't put down deep roots. Russia looks primarily for advantages to itself, which is to say, what can it get out of the relationship? It really does not have a model or an idea of what this country could do with Russia to actually make itself more prosperous and a happier place. Russia could make a few people in a country very rich, as we know, but it's not very good at making a country rich. So it doesn't really have very much to offer. It tends to underestimate the power of civil society, the power of journalists. It underestimates the power of Western countries when they put their mind to really trying to weigh in and affect the situation, which Western countries do not often do, but sometimes they do, as in Macedonia. It overestimates its own power and its ability to intimidate people. It has contempt for international organizations and regulation, which can cause problem in the long run. It has conflicting goals, and also an increasingly inflexible ideology that I think stems from an increasingly inflexible leader who you really don't want to cross. Under Putin, the Russians are not big on preparing Plan B or on red teaming what Putin wants. The best career path is to agree with what he wants, and that denies them some flexibility. So a long start, but not bad for a non-doctor.
Thank you, and apologies for that, but you know, you're an honorary doctor for us anyway. Did Putin miss opportunities in Ukraine because of Moscow's constant power posture, rather than using trade, economic ties, and people-to-people connections to form a strong relationship with Ukraine? Why was this route impossible? Was it because Russia remained an empire and the Kremlin could not think and act from any other perspective?
Well, John Herbst, who was U.S. ambassador to Ukraine starting in 2003, told me that at that time, Vladimir Putin was the most popular political figure in Ukraine. And somehow he managed to turn this around to the situation that has obtained since then. On a couple of occasions, in a few interviews, Putin did talk kind of wistfully about what Ukraine and Russia could have been. He referred to Canada and the United States. He referred to Germany and Austria, and with the idea that, yeah, maybe we could have pulled off something like that. But no, and why not? I think a good deal of it stems from the fact that Russia does not have a history of a good neighbor policy. They have rarely been good neighbors with anyone. Their relations are built pretty much on domination, which is a good idea. If you're a land empire, you really need to secure your borders and the lands beyond your borders. And to protect the lands beyond your borders, you need more lands beyond those borders. I mean, that's how land empires work. And one can understand that the idea of sort of trusting a country as close as Ukraine to be friendly is a certain kind of risk, and they're pretty risk averse when it comes to that kind of thing. But it does bring on these complications, and it led to a long series of bullying and economic fights with Ukraine and arrogant comments that put Ukrainians very much on edge. It didn't mean that Ukraine loved the West. In 2013, a year just before Maidan, more Ukrainians in a poll said that they thought NATO was a threat to Ukraine than they thought Russia was a threat to Ukraine. So it wasn't really that Ukrainians loved the West so much, but they were really put out of joint by Russia's behavior repeatedly. And yes, the Western countries were involved in all sorts of ways in Ukraine and funding various kinds of pro-democracy NGOs. And when your Assistant Secretary of State shows up on Maidan Square along with two members of Congress in the middle of the Maidan events, it does certainly look like the U.S. is getting involved in Ukrainian politics. But I think that properly managed, with a little less freaking out on the part of Russia over any kind of Ukraine toward the West, I think they probably could have managed a much better relationship.
Yes, and now we're at the point where Russia has launched the full-scale war against Ukraine. Do you see any chance in the future for reconciliation between the two countries?
It's hard to imagine any kind of decision by Putin himself to let bygones be bygones. I think he's cast this die himself in such a way that there won't be a lot of reconciliation. There could be a ceasefire, but I would not expect it to go much differently under Putin.
Thank you. So related to Ukraine and the European energy security is the subject of your research on Nord Stream 2. Moscow believed that Europe cannot survive without Russian energy, especially gas, since the Trans-Siberian pipeline has cemented these relationships back in the 70s. The war changed that entirely. But even before the full-scale invasion of Ukraine in February 2022, Russia was failing with Nord Stream 2. And why was that happening?
Russia had a lot of problems with Nord Stream 2. The first was that basically it wasn't needed. Western Europe was getting all the gas it needed, all the Russian gas it needed, through Nord Stream 1 and through other pipelines, especially through Ukraine. So the whole idea of Nord Stream 2 was essentially an anti-Ukraine project to create a second pipe to get gas from Russia to Germany and bypassing Ukraine. Somehow they managed to enlist all of Europe's energy giants in this, probably because they too were worried about some kind of conflagration between Russia and Ukraine, and for their own security wanted to make sure that they had some more reliable source of supply. But that was, that was only sort of the economic, technical aspect of why it wasn't needed. What we saw was quite a collection of forces against Nord Stream 2. We saw the United States issuing sanctions in 2019 that stopped the pipeline dead, even though Trump had indicated a year earlier that maybe it would be okay. Suddenly, wham, this just shows how unpredictable Trump can be. Bang, and he stops the pipeline. Denmark, little Denmark, played a spectacular role in holding up the pipeline for about 2 years, thinking about, well, which Danish waters should we allow it to pass through. It was very, very significant, that delay by Denmark. There were European environmentalists. There was the EU with all of its regulation. And I think that the Russians had the impression that, and we see this in other situations as well, that somehow any kind of legal or environmental things can be fixed. You just hire the right people, like Gerhard Schroeder, the right guy who can call a guy and fix it with the EU. And if Germany is the biggest contributor to the EU, so if Angela Merkel wants a pipeline, Angela Merkel will fix it, and we'll deal with Denmark. And we'll deal with environmentalists. I mean, we'll just run them over. And it turns out it's not that easy. That don't tangle with an EU regulator. These are serious people, and they cannot be ridden roughshod over. But again and again, we see, and we'll come to Sputnik too in that connection, that when it comes to international regulation, international law, regulators, bodies. The Russians just don't get it, this rule of law stuff. There ought to be some way to fix it, and they have trouble with that.
Yes, it is a bandit state. You can bypass the law, go under the law, above the law, depending on your size, and get away with it. But we have European Union with its solidarity clauses, and we have Poland contesting a lot of parts of this project, and successfully in European courts, which was going to be the reason for Nord Stream 2 to never come into operation. The European Solidarity Clause was recognized in one of those decisions and became a precedent for further future decisions. So the pipeline was, there was gloom and doom about the pipeline, and eventually it exploded, and we still don't know who did that. But when we had an event here at the Jamestown Foundation on the topic, I talked about motive and opportunity, of course. Who has the capacity to do it? Who has the small submarines to really put the explosives in the pipeline? Because the Russians' small submarine fleet is very well known and documented, and other damage has been done to cables in the Black Sea, in the Baltic Sea, to another pipeline recently in the Baltic Sea. So that was the capability, and that was also the opportunity. And why? Because they never were going to use that pipeline, but they could blame the West for blowing it up, or blame Ukraine for blowing it up. So subsequently, this project completely failed, not only Nord Stream 2, but also Nord Stream 1, which was suspended by the Russians. They suspended deliveries of gas even before Europe started importing enough American and other LNG to satisfy its needs. It's a very interesting case study, and since we've done quite a lot of work on energy here at Jamestown, it's really a case study of how Russia can miscalculate. It miscalculated as well with South Stream, which was cancelled. It succeeded with Turk Stream, that's a lot smaller capacity, and now most of the countries on this route are also rethinking whether they should be using Russian gas or not. But let's move to North Macedonia and to the Balkans, because North Macedonia is one example of Russian failure when Macedonia managed to change its name and join NATO in 2019. But at the same time, in 2016, we had a successful coup d'etat in Montenegro, which was also a big failure of Russia because it did not derail Montenegro's accession to NATO. The opposite actually consolidated the people and the desire in Montenegro to join NATO. Did we learn something from Macedonia, how successful in Western countering of Russian policies can be, and can we use it now, let's say, in the problem between Macedonia, North Macedonia and Bulgaria, and the delays with NATO, with EU accession as well?
Yeah, the North Macedonia case was pretty spectacular, actually, for something that nobody's ever heard of. It was actually one of the most aggressive and successful Western influence operations in some time. To recap briefly, as I said before, there was a constitutional amendment that needed to be passed to change the name of the country from Macedonia to North Macedonia. And the Russians and their allies, including Macedonian nationalists, were working very hard to get a no vote in a referendum and to have the Macedonian National Assembly not approve it. And the pro-Western elements and Western countries were working very hard in order to get this passed in the referendum and to get the National Assembly to pass the necessary constitutional changes. So the no group, the Russians and their allies, were all over social networks. The Russian ambassador was going around giving speeches about how Macedonia would become a target for Russian nuclear weapons if they join NATO. They're super. They brought speakers from Moscow. They really did a full court press along with some help from Serbia and other places. Alexander Dugin they brought in, as a matter of fact, to rally the pro-Putin forces, and there were demonstrations and allegations that the Russians were involved in actually paying for these demonstrations, although the Macedonian nationalists are quite capable of demonstrating on their own. It does seem from reports at the time that the Russians did help to fuel that additionally. So the West actually took very substantial action. They brought in PR experts to a PR company to help the Macedonian government. The Global Engagement Center of the State Department sent in a team to advise the pro-Western government of Zoran Zaev that was trying to get the yes vote. There was a lot of social network activity in favor of a yes vote. The NGOs, which have been funded for years by Western countries, were super active in it. The Americans did a wiretap that apparently showed that the Russians were funneling money to the no side of this referendum, and that wiretap made it into the right hands. So with one thing and another, they also brought in Angela Merkel. They brought in the British Prime Minister. The American Defense Secretary arrived. Macron sent a video. The amount of attention devoted to a country that most of these people could probably never have found on a map was just sensational in the period of about a year while all this was going on. And at the same time, I might say, that the United States and Russia both said repeatedly on the record that they were in no way interfering with the decision to be made by the Macedonian people. As it happened, the referendum, well, depending on how you view the referendum, it was either a success or not. There were a lot of complications in terms of the percentages and so forth. But in the final analysis in the vote in Parliament, there was a vote in favor of this name change. It was alleged that the government put very heavy pressure on a number of Parliament members, some of whom were facing criminal charges over various misdeeds in the past. It was given to understand, they were given to understand that perhaps if they voted the right way, these charges would be dropped. A lot of controversy about how true or false all of this was. But in any case, a lot of people in the West did very, very aggressive influence operation in that connection, and managed to get the result they wanted, leaving the Russians, I think, kind of astounded that in sort of a murky Balkan context where we think they're so great, that when the West really puts its mind to something, however squeaky clean the methods were, the West can accomplish what it wants.
Thank you. And it was actually a lot more complicated operation by the West, because if you remember at that time there was attack on parliament by violent groups in Macedonia. There were parliamentarians beaten up very badly. One Albanian parliamentarian barely survived that attack. And then at the same time, what was happening in Greece was very interesting, because Russian-funded groups were also staging protests in Greece to derail the agreement between the Prespa agreement between the two countries. So our State Department officials were going from Athens to Skopje, Skopje to Athens, back to Washington, Brussels, for months in order to calm down the tensions and make this possible. It was critically important for Macedonia to join NATO, because that would mean a lot more stability in the region. But then Russia turned to Sofia to stir another problem between the two countries, which is still ongoing, and we will see how this is going to be resolved, because if the government change in Sofia, this can raise to the fore again and become a really contentious issue. But let's turn to briefly to Ecuador. You mentioned already about Ecuador and South Africa, so maybe we should just go to COVID. COVID is a very interesting case study. The Russian vaccine entered the market first. It was announced before anybody else's vaccine. Even the Chinese vaccine was announced on the market, and way before the Western vaccines were available. And why didn't they succeed? Why didn't that vaccine become the most important, the most successful vaccine in the world market?
Well, they had everything together to really have a spectacular result. It was no accident that it was called the Sputnik vaccine, because they were hoping to repeat the impact of the Sputnik spacecraft. Here was an accomplishment of Russian science, leaving the West far behind, going to save the world. The people all over the world, one could imagine, and believe me, the West did imagine, would have their lives saved by Sputnik, be incredibly grateful to Russia, while Western vaccines were slow and the West was being selfish and all this kind of stuff. So it was like a fairy tale. I mean, it was like the best thing ever that could happen to Russia. But no, what happened? How did they mess this up? What happened was primarily a failure in manufacturing. They just could not manufacture the stuff in sufficient quantities. They brought in some outside, foreign manufacturers. They wanted to do it all themselves. The idea was that, they could have partnered with, some Western drug company and said, we got the formula, can you guys produce it? But no, they wanted to do this all themselves, and with a few hand-picked friends, particularly in BRICS countries and stuff. And they could not produce anything near the quantity that was necessary. Then they also accompanied this by the most malevolent possible propaganda campaign in which they claimed the Western drugs were dangerous, that they would give everybody all sorts of dread diseases. Then one of the Russians on TV, one of the Russian commentators said that the Western vaccines could turn people into chimpanzees because they did have some kind of monkey chemical element, actually, but anyhow, it didn't turn people into chimpanzees. And this very sort of this campaign sort of suffused with grievance and served with a side of snark was not the way you do it in international pharmacological circles. So this kind of shocked everyone. And then they also could not produce scientific evidence to convince the European Medicines Agency and the World Health Organization that this was a legit vaccine. They just couldn't provide the documentation and so forth. So which meant it was not certified for use in the EU, where there were a few countries that were desperate for it. Would have imported probably Sputnik if the EMA had signed off on it, and because the WHO didn't sign off on it, they could not include Sputnik in the COVAX facility, which is what provides large amounts of vaccine to some of the world's poorer countries. From every standpoint, production, failure to recognize and appease the regulators, the taking of a legitimate vaccine, I guess, and it seemed to work for a relatively short period at least, didn't kill anyone that we know of, but then trying to turn this scientific accomplishment into a propaganda tool. For all these reasons, it never became what it could have been, and wound up sort of the footnote in COVID vaccines when Chinese did a lot, and then the Western vaccines became the standard because the Chinese vaccines also were not that long lasting.
What the Russian propaganda against Western vaccines was a very, very detrimental effect on vaccines in general. They were trying to compromise the Western vaccines. They compromised the entire process of vaccination. A lot of people died because of this campaign. And I can tell you, in Bulgaria in particular, because the attitude was so negative about vaccination, so many people lost their lives as a result of that. It was absolutely unforgivable to believe that propaganda and to believe the Russians anything that they would say. Right now, they're trying their hand in Russia, in Africa, to convince the African societies that Western health programs are causing problems, health problems and effects and vaccinations and all these HIV medications that we're distributing in Africa free of charge, detrimental to human health. So this is going to have, if it succeeds, it's going to have a really devastating effect on Africa's population health. One last question, and I open for questions from the audience, is, in your book, you say, this book will attain its goal if it demonstrates that many Russian influence operations contain the seeds of their own destruction. If Russia's adversaries can anticipate, detect, and exploit them. And by recognizing the patterns of the Kremlin's setbacks of the past, pro-democracy forces can learn to counter Russian adventurism in the future. Have we learned that lesson in the West?
Well, I think we're still very reluctant in the West to confront Russian narratives. I think that the Western diplomats, Western governments, public diplomacy, so forth, are much more comfortable pointing to the good things that the West is doing than they are going after Russia. I think they feel that the more they talk about Russian propaganda, the more in a way they sort of promote it. or they'll sound defensive. So, instead of talking about, how the Russians are telling you not to take this vaccine, let's talk about the wells we're digging. Well, it seems to me you have to do both. And we are not really, we have been in the past, but these days it just seems to me that the Western countries are not really into an information war. There are sparks in it. I mean, you see it. I can point to a half dozen things in different countries that Western countries and agencies and their contractors have done. It's not like it's a completely unknown field. But I don't think that in most Western countries, there's some stuff, but in most Western countries, I don't think that they're very comfortable with, or as comfortable as they used to be in the Cold War, with propaganda or anything to be called propaganda. Even if it's true information presented in an assertive way, they sort of are a little squeamish about this kind of thing.
Thank you. Jamestown has published 3 books already on how Russia loses, pretty much, which is kind of unusual for our small publishing house here. We don't see that many books on the market dedicated to the topic that Russia is weak. It has the economy the size of Italy. It has nuclear weapons, but it doesn't have full control over all its territories and populations. There are a lot of ethnic groups that are revolting against the war and against being conscripted to fight in the war. The first book was Andres Wimbush's book on Russia in Decline, which is a compilation of essays. Then came Janusz Bugajski's book, Failed State, A Guide to Russia's Rupture. And now we have How Russia Loses. A pretty good record for a small organization with very good insight, big insight into Russia, Eurasia, and Europe. So let me open for questions now. Please.
Sure.
Yes.
Alejandro Sanchez, an analyst here in DC. Question.
I'm sorry, from where?
I work for different companies, James, for example, and I cover Latin America. So I understand you had a chapter about the Correa administration in Ecuador, which was unsuccessful. But at the same time, if I can push back, there have been some successful examples of Russia approaching Latin America. Venezuela, Cuba, Bolivia, and I will say Nicaragua is a great example. Nicaragua, with the Daniel Ortega administration, is one of the few countries that recognizes South Ossetia, Abkhazia. They have apparently a consulate in Crimea, out of all places. Just last January, a delegation from the so-called Republic of Crimea went to Nicaragua. They met with the National Assembly. They were very well welcomed there. So I was wondering if you can talk more about, yes, there have been plenty of unsuccessful examples of Russia approaching Latin America, but there have been some successful cases where relationships have matured and continue to this day.
Yeah, por supuesto. I don't doubt it. It's absolutely true. And certainly my goal is not to say that every country in Latin America, Russia is losing everywhere. But I think it's a very dynamic situation, as it usually is in Latin America, and there are ways that the West can improve its odds in these situations. There have been significant setbacks that you point to correctly. Maybe some steps forward, depending on how you want to look at Milei in Argentina. I mean, here's somebody who is super pro-Ukraine, which is nice to see. So maybe in some Latin American forums, the voice of Argentina is not insignificant. But all of this, all of these Russian tendencies tend to repeat themselves in Latin America too. So if Russia continues in many Latin American countries not to have a very high profile for itself, not to really sink deep roots with the population, they're not out building stuff and doing stuff. It's sort of closed circle with the elites sometimes. So we do see the seeds of some problems. But yeah, I mean, they're certainly active in Latin America. And RT in Espanol is particularly helpful with help from Telesur.
Please, please.
I'm Greg Rushford. I publish an online journal called the Rushford Report. Could you tell me what's going on in Moldova these days and why it's important?
Well, it's a big question, but Moldova is important because if Russia wins in Ukraine, Moldova will be next, probably. So it's a very at-risk country that's very divided into pro-Russia and pro-Western camps, with a very strong pro-Western government, a lot of aid, a lot of projects going into Moldova to show Western strength, trying to replace Russian energy with Western energy. You go around Moldova, as I have, and everywhere you look, there's an EU project or a USAID project or a British project. I went to one place and found a Liechtenstein project. So, like everybody is really trying to do something in Moldova. But the Russians have got their hands on a very, resentful, sort of grievance-filled community there. Russian is the lingua franca of the place. I mean, Romanian is the official language, but everybody seems to speak Russian. And so the very active Russian information operations in Russia, in Moldova, reach the Romanian-speaking people as well.
Although the government did take measures to curtail disinformation and introduce new laws, and the most important thing that the government did was switching to gas delivered from the west, from Romania through Romania and through Ukraine. But it's still dependent on electricity being produced in Transnistria. And that's the problem. Transnistria uses Russian gas to produce electricity. These are the biggest energy capacities, electricity capacities in Moldova that still still remain very vulnerable. So if Russia stops electricity deliveries from Transnistria on command from Russia to Moldova, there is going to be a problem. People are going to complain that they have high energy prices, and it's a very easy way to stir protest against this pro-Western and very solid government that they have.
Hi, my name is Kyle Tucker. I'm a Scoville Fellow at the Nuclear Threat Initiative, and I was hoping you could talk a little bit more about the legacy of using medicine and disease as kind of a common thread in Russian propaganda. You talked about the COVID example. Historically, there was the conspiracy theories surrounding AIDS, and then particularly related to my organization's line of work is the unfounded allegations against the Lugar biological security centers in Georgia, Kazakhstan, Ukraine. What do you kind of see as the legacy of this going forward, and why it's such a common thread in a lot of Russian propaganda efforts?
Well, one thing people care about is their health, and so I think they were smart to decide that this could be a vector of influence. And it's true that the Western countries are very busy in health initiatives all over the world for all sorts of good reasons. But everywhere there's a health initiative, there's an injection, and there's inevitably a lab, and the Russians are making hay with it. They're doing it in Africa quite aggressively. I suppose that again, the best response would be to an information threat like that, would be an information response. The Russian claims are so ridiculous when you talk about turning people into chimpanzees and things like this. I mean, they write the script. If we would just turn it around with a proper amount of eyebrow raising and let people behold the kinds of things that Russia is saying, I think it could be quite effective. But again, I think there's this tendency to not want to see it, or to consider that sober-minded thought will always prevail, and that and it won't be effective. But health and medicine conspiracy theories are very effective, and we see that in our own country too. And so, if you wanted to say, of all the different kinds of Russian influence operations and the threats they pose, which one's an emergency? You could really say that health is the emergency, because people actually die from not taking vaccines and so forth. So, but where that stands on the list of priorities is limited. I suppose that we can't always say the government has to fix everything. The U.S. government has to go out and do this. One could see a role here for private initiatives that are interested in this. One could see a role for pharmaceutical companies who have some money. If they wanted to get active in this area, it could be very effective. You don't have to wait for the U.S. government to do everything.
That's an excellent point. The civil society could be funded by pharmaceutical companies and business interests in different countries, especially in Africa, which is up and coming in terms of economic development.
Right,
and it's so important for Western companies, and not only Western companies, to have a healthy working population.
$10,000 goes a long way in Africa in terms of trying to affect the information environment.
But the other problem I see is that we have not turned to using information as a tool. We are still on the defensive. We're not on the offensive in terms of information. We have not turned the tables with the truth, armed with the truth, to really be much more active, including in social media, with very well organized efforts through different websites to do so. We don't do that. We think it's below us and we think it's a Russian tactic. No, the truth can be used as a tool, and we could be on the offensive the way the Ukrainians actually are, very successful in countering Russian disinformation about the war and about everything else. Any other questions, please?
Hi, Brady Bialik. I'm a graduate student at the Texas A&M Bush School. My question is more on the U.S. side, as you've alluded to in your conversation. During the Cold War, kind of standard practice to meet Soviet tactics with force, right? Force on force, and you need to stand up to them, and that seems to have faded, right, over time. I'm curious what your thoughts are on why that trend has occurred, particularly in U.S. policy circles when facing Russian tactics.
I think part of it may stem from the war on terrorism, sort of a feeling that we didn't do a very good job in that. I think actually we accomplished a lot. A lot of people are not dead because of things that the U.S. and other countries did to discourage people from going to Syria and things like that. But there may be some perception that the war on terrorism sort of was unpleasant, and information operations were part of that, so it sort of splashes off on the idea of information operations. Then, this whole idea of that sort of we should fix our own problems first, and that America is not a great model for the rest of the world, so why should we go around telling people how great we are? This conflates the idea that the problem here is it conflates the idea of going around telling people how wonderful we are with going around and being in favor of democracy and human rights. You could design a human rights and democracy campaign that has nothing to do with America. I think that most people in most countries do not dream of, Capitol Hill. I mean, they dream of, freedom of speech in their own country. That's what they care about. But we seem to have, some of us seem to have hypnotized ourselves to think that unless we are the model, then it's not worth campaigning for these values, which I view as human values and not American values. So you stir all that together along with the general feeling on all sides politically in the United States that propaganda is a bad thing, and suspicion about the deep state and the general risk averseness which seems to reign in many parts of USG, and in that whole confection somewhere you lose the thread of information warfare.
Last question. Yes. We're about to wrap up. So any last minute question? Thank you very much all for coming today to listen to Tom Kent. Thank you
And Margarita.
for a wonderful book. And thank you for this excellent job showing the weaknesses of Russia. And now it's time for us to learn how to use those weaknesses to succeed.
Thank you. Thank you.